Okay. To everyone who's here, I'm so happy to be here. Welcome to How to Earn My One, presentation by Makai Henry. And we're going to roll through our table of contents real quick. So I'm going to do four things here today. I'm going to go through who am I, kind of background, Congress philosophy, plus some additional thoughts. Then we're going to do a little bit of a round walkthrough of the round, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. I don't like to be yapped at for long periods of time, so I'm not going to spend a long period of time yapping at you. I want to have a discussion with some of you guys. I want to see how you guys are feeling about Congress and see if we can talk shop and generally just have a discussion about the state of the event and where you want to go in the event. Okay. So in terms of who I am, my name is Makai Henry. I'm your lecturer here today. I am a sophomore at Florida International University down south, Miami's public research university. Go Panthers. I was a four-year competitor for Nova High School in Broward County, located in Davie, Florida. Now I coach Walt Whitman High School up in Maryland, and I serve on occasion as like a volunteer coach chaperone for Nova High School as well. I private coach as well, and this is my sixth. This season we're going into will be my sixth year of involvement in the activity. Now, regarding Congress philosophy and all that jazz, I think a primer on Congress philosophy in a few broad strokes can go pretty much like this. I think that congressional debate is both speech and debate, and that's very specific nomenclature. When judges are instructed on how to judge Congress for the first time, they're given the nomenclature of you should be ranking speakers on whether or not they are the best legislator in the round. And that's a holistic judgment. So that doesn't just mean the best speaker. It doesn't just mean the best debater. It means the best legislator, which is a combination of both speech and debate. So that is a holistic analysis of every single thing that you do in the round. All of those things are subject to judging. So whether that's the face that you make while somebody gives an argument while they're speaking, as your parli is watching your faces, or that's how you interact with judges and other people in the round, whether or not you're being respectful, all of those things are valid judging criteria. And frankly, judges in congressional debate have an incredible amount of discretion as to what they can speak, what they can judge you on, what they can rank you on, what they can ultimately evaluate and give you ranks on. Then I think the second most important part of my Congress philosophy is really asking yourself this question: will my judge remember me tomorrow? And I think that's a really important question, because if your judge doesn't remember you tomorrow, doesn't remember you like the day after, especially if they're your parliamentarian and they spent 9 hours in round with you, I think that's a really an easy metric to gauge yourself on how well am I doing in this round. And then, as I think is some common guidance, basically every speech after the first cycle should refute or interact with other speakers. And honestly, I think as the first neg, you should probably be interacting with other speakers as well, because if you're not interacting with other speakers, I'm not sure if you guys have heard this common refrain, but I'm sure somebody has said it to you at one point or the other. If you are not refuting other speakers, congressional debate is not debate. It is congressional oratory. And look, I'm sure there are some great presenters out there, but I don't think any of you guys signed up to do this and to do oratory. I think you guys signed up to come and debate and have arguments with other people. So for the love of God, when you are in a round, you must refute other speakers. And then and lastly, warranting is everything. Warranting is paramount. You need, like, it's not just enough to tell me, hey, here's the logic of X argument leads to X thing. I want you to mechanically explain how X argument leads to X impact or Y impact to vary up my variables. But I need you to really like lock in and explain to me exactly how you get from point A to point B in your argumentation. Because a lot of the biggest like falling points, a lot of the biggest shortcomings in a lot of like arguments that I see from younger debaters is that you guys just tend to not make the connections between point A and point B. Like if you're going to give me this large top-down overarching argument, I need to see how you get to this very important impact. Because if you're going to tell me 1 million people are going to die, or 30,000 people are going to be pushed into poverty. You need to tell me mechanically how that happens as a result of X piece of legislation. It's not enough to say carbon tax bad, carbon tax leads to people in poverty and higher prices. Explain to me why it happens. I think a really easy way to do that is by actually just mechanically citing the piece of part of the legislation that gets something done. Moving on to some additional thoughts, I think Congress is a game of three things. First, Congress is a broad appeal game, so being a splitter is bad. Second, Congress is an optics game. And third, and finally, Congress is a judge game. Congress is really just a game of three things. If you keep track of those three things, you'll be absolutely fine in congressional debate. So, in terms of optics, Aaron, is that a question?
Yeah. What's a splitter?
Sorry, a legislator?
What's a splitter?
A splitter. I'm going to go into depth on that next, but basically a splitter is somebody whose ranks are kind of polarizing. So let's say you're going like 2-7, 4-8. Those kind of ranks are what I would refer to as kind of splitter ranks. Your goal is to really be consistent with your ranks. But before we get into like rank consistency, let's talk about optics for a second. So generally, our friends at OpenAI have supplied us with this great definition of optics, where they provide us with this definition. Optics refers to public and media perceptions of events, decisions, and actions, emphasizing image and appearance over actual substance and reality. And so, number one thing is to illustrate, you never want to be that guy over there on the podium who's like reaching over, who's yelling, and you can see spittle quite literally flying out of his mouth. So to further illustrate, I'm going to give two examples that I witnessed over the course of the last season. So at Florida Nova States, I had three kids in the final round. Go me. Two of them were up at the front of the room, standing and taking suggestions for docket, and essentially trying to serve as like the pro tempore, or like the presiding officer before the presiding officer gets elected. So that's a thing that happens sometimes in Florida and some national tournaments as well, depending on whether or not you have a parli. But I find most commonly it happens in Florida, where kids will kind of like stand up in front of the room and parley and serve as presiding officer before there's a presiding officer elected. And generally, they'll be calling splits and running the introductory motions. But usually I advise people that I work with to go and like kind of stand up in front of the room and be seen in a very visible and very active as an active participant of the round, because I think it helps them be seen as more perceptionally dominant. And really, the goal of that is to try and cement yourself in the mind of the judges and everyone else participating in the round that you're a visible participant and that you're a visible leader in the round. Now, in this scenario, here's where things went completely out of control. So I had two of these kids coming up trying to pro temp. Then another kid went up and tried to contest them. This kid was actually really successful at undermining the perceptual dominance, because he basically just made them look like people who are trying to get an unfair advantage over the course of the round by setting themselves up as like dominant figures in the round before. Then one of the kids I was working with, he responds belligerently and is basically like, no, I'm not going to sit down. No, I'm not going to facilitate you in this round. And then what basically ends up happening is, because they're so concerned and they're like so caught up with the bluster and the show performance of what they're doing, the kid who basically sat back down ends up running pro temping while sitting down, because he ends up basically giving them directions. So that's an example of how being too belligerent while you're standing up in front of the room can actually be a net negative. Then, as another example that I saw, as a positive example of what I saw in a Harvard quarters round that I was spectating this year, because there was a kid I was coaching that was in that round, and I was spectating the round. I saw there were three presiding officer candidates. However, one of the presiding officer candidates basically went to the front of the room at the start of the round, started calling splits, started calling docket nominations, and started caucusing with the round with the rest of the chamber very, very early, and was able to get them himself in front and ahead of all the other presiding officer candidates. Then there's another student who's standing up and also trying to kind of contest control and the authority and attention of the round, and is standing at the well of this lecture hall, so at the very bottom point near the parley. And this kid standing up trying to preside or trying to pro temp basically puts his hand on his shoulder and tells him to sit down. And the kid does. And from that moment, he was going to preside that. He's going to preside that round. It got so bad to the point that he quite literally sat down next to the parley and was setting up his PO sheet before he'd even been elected. So that's another example of just how important optics are. And then I think as a final piece, I had another student in Harvard quarters this year as well, and they gave a speech that I thought was pretty solid, and I thought that looking at the round, they were on track to break with. Then, for whatever reason, they didn't have a speech, or I think it was recency. They end up spending the rest of the round not very active and just kind of like writing a speech, and then they end up speaking at the end of the round. And what happens is they give this speech, but I quickly deduce that it is a constructive speech that's been disguised as if it was a crystal. And the judges very clearly see the speech, the kid bombs the speech, and they end up going from being on track to break, and then not even getting the bid out of Harvard quarters. So that's another point where consistency in optics is incredibly important. When you're talking about the optics of like the round and how you're doing, you need to be very consistent in your performance. So if you're going to be consistently in a high round presence role, you need to basically show your chops. You need to show that you know what you're doing. So on splitting, regarding ranks and splitting, your goal is generally to pick up as many high ranks as humanly possible. So what you see on your screen right now is my own ranks from 2 different tournaments. You want your ranks to be really so dominantly high that it doesn't matter if you take a random 9. So under a broad appeal example, I went 11915. That's really great. On the other example, I went 79149. So while I did pick up, I was kind of polarizing that round. I picked up a 1 and a 4, but then I got hit with 2 9s and a 7. As opposed to when you have a large panel and you're trying to make that broad appeal that you're seen as unanimously pretty decent by everyone in the round, that's much better than splitting and having your ranks go 1-4, 1-9. So generally your goal here is to have consistently good performances that don't polarize your judges and don't send them screaming and flying away from you. Then regarding Congress being a judge game, I think generally, while judges are important, I think the judges that you should be most wary of are parleys, whereas we were colloquially know them on circuit, or more formally as parliamentarians. The reason why you should be more wary of them is because of the fact that they are the most visible and vocal adult in the room. And in my opinion, I think that they tend to have outsized influence on the rest of the judge panel. And in many cases, off the top of my head, I imagine probably 50, 60% of the time, they are some of the most qualified judges in the pool. And especially in out rounds like major T60s, for example, Blue Key, Emory, Yale, your parleys are going to be experienced judges, former competitors, and in a mix. And honestly, there are many who are on circuit who are judging and competing actively, who are a mix of all 3. And parleys are really important because they're empowered to make binding decisions on procedure and round. And the reason that they really matter is because imagine the nightmare scenario where you're giving your speech, or perhaps you're even sitting down, flowing the speech, and then for whatever reason, the parliamentarian calls out your conduct, you're dead in the water. Namely, because getting into a verbal argument with your parley in front of the chamber, in front of your entire judge panel, isn't going to do you any favors. And I think, honestly, it's liable to get you dropped. But broadly, I think that there are 2 types of parleys. So you're going to have like the more kind of like activist parleys, what I like to call activist parleys, and you have the more passive parleys. So you have parleys who are kind of just like dead fish. They're willing to let the round run as the round runs, and they basically want to stay out of involvement with the round unless they absolutely have to get involved in the case of like an amendment or something. In those cases, I think you're going to find it a lot easier to get away with things that are technically not necessarily allowed by the rules. For example, both myself and our illustrious camp director, Nicholas Anthony Osterheimer, have both impeached presiding officers in our career. The NSDA's rules say absolutely nothing about impeaching a presiding officer. If you were to ask, like, let's say Adam Jacoby, I'm almost certainly he would tell you, you cannot impeach a presiding officer. However, it hasn't stopped kids from doing it in the past. So with more passive parliage, you're gonna have a much easier time in manipulating the rules in a charitable fashion, we're going to say. And then with activist parleys, you're going to see parleys who are more engaged, who are more kind of in key with like round engagement and just like staying active and engaged and watching the round and maybe make some round commentary. And then as a brief disclaimer, I think it's really important that for as much as I pretend to be the authority on all things Congress, I am in fact actually not the authority on all things Congress. I really encourage you guys to go out and seek as many new opinions and theories of practice on congressional debate as humanly possible. Because, for example, if you go back and watch the footage of, like, let's say, Hunter Brown at Nats in 2019, the conclusions and philosophy that guided him to giving his speeches and ultimately becoming the national champion out, and I think it was Houston, are not the same conclusions that guided Lawal to being, I think, the first Black national champion ever in congressional debates history in the 77-year history of the event, even as both a supplemental and main event. So whenever you next see him, give him his flowers. But either way, those conclusions are not going to be the same ones that hopefully guide you to becoming a national champion. Because I think that every debater should really go through their own process of exploration that leads them to unique conclusions about their event. But in the event that you do end up becoming national champion after watching this lecture, please do tell me. I would be very happy to know that this lecture inspired a future national champion. And then in terms of our round walkthrough, I think there are broadly 4 stages to the round. So there's the pre-round, the early round, the mid-round, and the late round. And I guess there's the unofficial 5th stage, the post-round. But I think that's less important for the context of our discussion. So generally, if I were to analyze what a debater should be doing in the pre-round, that pre-round is that block of time in which chambers are released, but before the round has started. Sometimes chambers might blast at, like, let's say 9 in the morning, but round won't start till 9:35, 9:45. Although there are a number of tournaments which will release chamber blasts like 10 minutes before. But that pre-round time block of time is very important. Basically, what you should be doing is identifying your strategy for the round, whether that be like your high round presence that day, you want to be a low round presence, or you want to be some mix, or you're not entirely concerned with it at all. I think immediately after you get that blast, you should run to your chamber, and then you should start talking to people, start talking people, start kind of ingratiating yourself with the group and kind of cementing yourself as a visible presence. Because the number one thing that you don't want to happen is you don't want to be the kid who's like standing out and is basically kind of like self excommunicated from the group and is not involved in the active proceedings of the round. You always want to be involved in docket setting and the kind of caucusing with your fellow legislators.
Well, I have a question.
Shoot.
What's high round presence and low round presence?
Okay, so I think so. When I say terms like high round presence and low round presence, really what I'm talking about is, okay, let's say you go into round and you're being very visible, you're very vocal, you're very active as a leader, and you're very involved in like the motioning and procedure of the round and like the functions of making sure things go well, like you're calling for splits. That's what I would describe as high round presence. But you can also gain the higher round presence, or like round status, I would call it. By basically just being a good legislator, giving good speeches is another way to gain a higher level of round presence. What I refer to more typically as low round presence is somebody who's not very involved in what the processes of what's going on in the round. Or you can always be some mix. It really depends on your strategy, and it really depends on the context of the round. Because in some round, like in, let's say, in out rounds, like let's say you're in blue key finals or you're in sunbite finals, you're going to have a lot of more of confident debaters, and it might not always be to your strategy to just like try and pro-tempt the round or to try and be very active and vocal in the round, because you can still win the round either way. It doesn't always matter, but sometimes it can help. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so now it's the early round. So what? So if you're in the early round, you basically have a few responsibilities. First, you need to either establish or challenge the framing of the debate. Then, if you're like the author, sponsor of first affirmative, you need to explain the mechanism of the legislation, plus its solvency, or if you're on the neg, you can explain its insolvency, let's call it. And then you also need to introduce a narrative that guides the debate. And I think off the neg, if you're on the neg as like the, let's say, the first negative, you really have two choices, right? You can either basically kind of just give like a bland constructive, or I think is my default approach, at least when I was a competitor, was sometimes if we had arguments that would clash very well together, what I would do is I would try to stand up very early, try to get the speech immediately after. I'd flow the author first affirmative sponsor speech, and then try and get like a very large opening broadside kind of block of refutation on that person to try and kind of like assassinate their credibility in front of the judges at the very start of the round. Which, because I find that very good authors can some, if you're on the neg, can, or very good authors, sponsors, or first affirmatives can be a thorn in your side because they spoke very early. They're going to have good recency for the rest of the recency and precedence for the rest of the round, and they can basically act as a thorn in your side and just kind of like pepper your side and prosecute the case with questions and expose you guys in cross. So it can be helpful to mitigate their credibility very early in the round. And to read off kind of my mental rubric on really great speakers, especially on the AF, they're going to have like really confident delivery. You need to have minimal to no fluency breaks, especially if you're the author or sponsor. It's not as much as a bar for like great fluency in presentation as the first affirmative, because you didn't necessarily write the bill. The bill doesn't necessarily come from your school. Although NSCA rules will tell you that there technically is no difference between first affirmative sponsorships or authorships. But either way, you guys know what I'm talking about. I think that, in my opinion, at least when I'm judging, the bar for performance is a little bit lower if you're giving the first affirmative as opposed to giving the sponsorship or the authorship, especially if you're the author. You should be able to give this speech you should have minimal pad dependence while you're giving that speech, because you're claiming allegedly to be the author and you're bringing the legislation to the chamber, to the floor. So you need to do a good job of kind of like introducing legislation, framing the argumentation, framing the arguments, and creating a cohesive and convincing, strong narrative. Yes. Is that a question?
Yeah. Would memorizing like an authorship or a sponsorship be a good idea?
Generally, my advice is never to memorize a speech. My advice is more to familiarize your speech. And while those two things sound very similar, what I really want you to do is I want you to give that speech a lot of dry runs. Like, and when I say a lot of dry runs, I mean like practice the speech before round. Like, you should not have just padded the speech last night and the first time you're ever giving it is in the round. Like, I want you to run this speech probably like 5, 6 times. Let's say it's the second day of a tournament. You're going into the second day of a tournament like Blue Key, like a major T60. Let's say it's like the night before the second day, and you've written a sponsorship or authorship that day. I think you should be like giving that speech 6, 7 times that night, and then probably give it a few times that when you wake up in the morning, to just make sure that it's like sunk in, that you're very familiar with how you're mechanically going to deliver the speech, and then you can make adjustments as well. I think what's really important that you do memorize is memorize your intros. Like, for the love of God, please, please, please do not come up to the front of the chamber and read your intro off of your pad. I would honestly rather you extemp your intro than you just like read it off the top of your pad. Because reading off your top of your pad, like, you lose those first, I want to say, 15 to 20 seconds when like the parent judge is listening to your speeches. Because if you guys have ever went to a local tournament and it's like a CFL on a Saturday or something, and it's Timmy's mom is not particularly concerned with listening to your speech after the first 15 to 20 seconds if you don't give Timmy's mom that time to buy into your speech and time to buy into your argumentation. It is really, really, really important that you give those first 15, 20, 30 seconds to deliver your intro with eye contact. Although if you really have to, in the intro, I find that even reading is better than fluency breaks. So if you know you can't extemp to save your life, as the end all be all, I guess reading is okay, but your goal is to avoid reading your intro at all times. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. And then, so now it's the mid round. So why do you care? Basically, the mid round is in my opinion, probably the largest block of the round, starting at earliest after the second cycle, and depending on the size of the chamber, may go to sixth or seventh cycle. And the mid round can really give speakers incredible opportunities to change the status quo of the debate. So when I mean change the status quo of the debate, I mean you're challenging the established facts and norms of the round, and then you're trying to create as many points of friction as you possibly can. I think really, really great speakers at this point in the round and especially the ones who I tend to rank very highly, are speakers who create arguments that hijack the round and short circuit the other round, especially if you can make it an inflection point for the other round. And when I say inflection point, what I mean is positioning yourself in a way that for the other side to access their impacts and prosecute their case on the rest of your side, they have to reckon with your argument first. So a really good indicator that you've done this well is when you're, let's say, running a unique-ish argument. So you're a little bit off the beaten track of the stock. You're not like, we're going to nuclear war if we pass this legislation, but like, here's this niche impact that nobody was really expecting. So you have this unique-ish argument that's being picked up when you have a unique-ish argument that's being picked up by nearly every speaker in the other side of the debate. That's when you know you've done a really good job of making the round a referendum on yourself. So like a really good metric is if the path to relevancy in this round relies on people saying your name, you've done a great job. And that's how you know you're doing well in the mid round. We can talk shop a little bit later if you guys are interested in how I think about crafting kind of inflection point arguments. And then towards the late round, and just how to make your judge, which I call just how to make your judge's life easier, speakers in the late round typically need to concern themselves with two things. Actually, now that I say that, I'm giving myself flashbacks to myself as a competitor being like, there are two things in this round that everyone should care about, the kind of two worlds framework. But either ways, there are two things. First, a whole lot of ref, and second, weighing the arguments of the round. And I think, well, generally that's pretty valid. I think that these things are some that things that someone speaking in the late round should be doing. I think that they should consider a third metric, because if you consider it from the perspective of the judge, in a large round, by the time that we make it to the end of the debate on a bill, a judge might have already heard like 20 speeches over the course of the debate. And if you extend that logic to a 3-hour round with 20 kids, a judge will probably hear 40 plus speeches before the round is over. And for a parliamentarian, if it's 3 days, it's like, for a parliamentarian, if we have 3 prelim rounds all in one day, there are some tournaments which schedule like that. A parli might end up hearing 100 plus speeches in a day. Plus, if they're coaches or something, they might end up hearing their kids' speeches 10 to 15 additional times. So if you're speaking in the late round, what you should really be focusing on is this third metric, which I like to call making my life easier. And to borrow a term from PF, when you're crystallizing a round, I just want you to give me the voting issues of the round and tell me why I should value your side's advocacy over the other side, and tell me really why your arguments matter, why your arguments are impactful, and why I should care. So when you're crystallizing, it's really important that you focus on, hey, am I telling a coherent narrative? Am I giving a decent amount of ref? Am I executing it well? Am I weighing the arguments of the round? And sometimes it's probably better than to just give line by line ref and just like, Speaker X told you why, Speaker Z told you why. You should give me, hey, no less than 3 separate speakers have all come up to the well of this chamber and basically sold you snake oil, telling you that this legislation is going to do X, Y, and Z. Terrible thing. So you really want to just kind of maybe sometimes group arguments that are kind of mutually in lines with themselves. And then I think for our presentation, after I think going on 32 minutes of speaking, I am happy to open myself up to Q&A. So if anybody has questions about this presentation, please feel free to ask. Okay. Tenmei, you get the first cross.
How would you go about structuring the late round so it's as easy to comprehend for the judges as possible? Since you said like make their life as easy as possible, what do you think is the best structure for them to like logically go about that?
generally, I find that the easiest structure, especially if you're grouping arguments, I find is probably like make it a two questions referendum. So be like, fundamentally, this round is about two questions. One, whether or not this legislation sinks more Americans to urban poverty. And second, whether or not this legislation is going to reduce educational outcomes for Americans all across the board. Because the answer to this question is fundamentally yes, you have to vote in the affirmation. Senators X, Y, and Z will come up here and tell you X statistic that says X terrible thing or X good thing is going to happen. But that's the kind of example. I think two worlds, a kind of two questions or maybe three questions framing is very useful in terms of like just parsing the voting issues of the round, because sometimes while like nice opening blocks of refutation kind of like opening broadside that goes like line by line, X senator told you Y, X senator told you Z. Some of those times when kids deliver those, they can just get really kind of exhausting to listen to. I think an example of those kind of like exhausting speeches, I think, is towards the tail end of, I want to say Senate Nats 2022 out in Louisville. There's a kid from Ridge who gave like a really long speech that kind of just that was like line by line ref. Rohan.
When you're doing research for the bill, what do you think is the best way to come up with that argument or impact line that basically, as you said, hijacks around or like forces people to come back and reference your name?
So I think the best way to kind of research and kind of like trap people is a lot of bills are kind of context heavy, or a lot of bills are seem simple in implementation and policy, but actually have like a lot of nuance in them. But especially for those chunkier bills, you know, those big boy bills, you know, you guys know what I'm talking about, like those really long like bills that are about like whatever X policy. A lot of those bills are like high kind of research content, like high research value, like very context heavy debates. The best thing for you to do in those situations is just research the life out of the bill. And when I say like research the life out of the bill, I mean like before you eat, this is pretty standard Congress advice, but it really is helpful. And it like actually as a coach, I realize it's way more than I did as a competitor. But generally what you want to be doing is, let's say you get the bill packet like a week before, spend like an hour and a half just like really reading about the context of the bill. Like what I like to do is screenshot the bill, paste it into a Word document or paste it into a Google document, and then just like break down the bill to my best of my understanding, then go through the sections of the bill and see what I think is directly relevant and I can make impactful arguments about, and then just kind of do a little bit of background research and cut some cards before I even like decide what side I'm going to speak on. And once you've done that, you get a pretty comprehensive argument understanding of the actual mechanisms and links of the bill that makes you 10 to 1 better than most debaters. Because especially like in like, let's say prelims or even like some like early out rounds, so like let's say it's like Harvard quarters or something, or like national like House quarters, you're going to see varying qualities of research. So just knowing what you're talking about makes your life a lot easier, because you can just walk into round with instantaneous confidence. And when you've done that, you get an understanding of what the stock tends to look like. So you want to be accessible to the stock. So you don't want to be hyper unique. Like you don't want to argue like you don't want to be out there like arguing about let's say REMs on like a carbon tax bill, when like the framing of the like let's say the affirmation is all about like renewables or like some hyper niche part of like environmental capacity. Like if somebody has like a pre-prep speech and they're kind of like flowing around, you want to be like maybe a station or two away from where they are so that your arguments are still accessible.
Okay.
That answer your question?
Question on that? Yeah, super quick follow-up question on that. So
sure.
Come up with your arguments and understand the bill just from reading it before you go out on like Google and do background research there.
Yeah, like definitely read the bill before you start doing background research. And then like you're probably gonna have some questions about what the bill does. Go research your questions.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Aaron.
What role do you think rhetoric plays in defining yourself in the mind of a judge?
Rhetoric is incredibly important, and I think that rhetoric's value depends on who you are as a speaker, right? So there are some people who like are very performative and lean into kind of like performance over just like hard technical debate. Um, I think the best congressional debaters eventually kind of manage to get a middle ground on both of those. But there are some debaters who I think just lean more performative in nature. And I think people like, let's say, if you go watch House finals in 2019, like Hunter Brown, or like, let's say, what's his name? I forget who won the Senate that year. It was Rohit Jawar, right? Go watch those rounds, and you'll see some of the best like rhetorical orators on I think to ever have ever done congressional debate. But more broadly, in terms of like how it helps you define yourself for the judges, I think it's I think rhetoric is important because I think an undervalued aspect of congressional debate is there is a role play aspect to this event. Like it's both speech and debate. And I think kids like overemphasize debate sometimes and they like kind of like forget about the rhetoric and the fact that you have constituents with lives, with jobs, with careers and aspirations and families to feed. And I think if you are kind of just impacting out to like the common denominator of just like, hey, we have American citizens, their lives are going to be either negatively or positively affected. As long as you ground yourself in that reality, I think it's a lot easier to make convincing arguments that you set yourself up as like optically like a kind of like moral leader in the round. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, Neil.
So how would like intro slash conclusion differ? Like how would you approach it differently from a sponsorship versus like a crystallization speech
Repeat
at
your
the
question
end?
really briefly.
So like how would an intro slash conclusion differ from a crystallization speech versus like a sponsor early round speech?
Okay, so with a okay, let's say with a crystallization, with a crystal speech, or like an early round, like very like kind of constructive speech, the difference in the difference in rhetoric, I think, in like intros and conclusions should be pretty dramatic because when you're like very early in the round, especially as like let's say an author or something, you have a very high bar for performance that I think as you get later in the round, the bar for performance is not nearly as high because you're being adaptive in the you're like adapting to the round and your arguments and your argumentation and the way you're structuring arguments is constantly changing. So I think it's a lot more malleable and you have like a lot less of a kind of rhetorical burden. So when I'm talking about like thinking about intros and conclusions, for like let's say an authorship, like they should never be canned. Like you should not have like a bunch of cross applicable intros that would apply to like any authorship you've ever written. So like this should be a unique intro that you are writing for this speech. And I think a key way to distinguish that is when you're building an authorship, you're going to have a kind of like narrative structure, whether that be like a kind of like storybook, like rising action, a falling tension kind of thing structure going on with your speech, or you're just kind of like, okay, here are these foundational ideals that we have as Americans, or these values that this subsect of people shares, or probably maybe like some historical fact. Like for example, to give an example of an intro that I gave back as a competitor, I wrote this speech about Sri Lanka, and it went like, in 2010, at the dawn of a new decade, the governor of Sri Lanka's central bank had this to say: the future is bright. The people of Sri Lanka will be able to control inflation, keep interest rates low, and maintain an unprecedented level of infrastructure development. But after 10 years, the people of Sri Lanka were robbed of that future. This legislation is the only chance to give back what they were robbed of. I really butchered that intro, but about a year and a half ago when I had that intro memorized, it was a lot better. But that's kind of like the difference in terms of like you're going hyper performative, your bar for performance is a lot higher, and generally Like I think like your intros and like let's say an authorship can maybe run like 25, 30 seconds. If you're like giving like a very late round speech, your intro should probably not be running any more than like 15 to 20. That's kind of the difference. It's like a timing and also like the type of rhetoric that you use.
Okay, thank you.
Riley.
What are some things that like POs can do to improve their ranks in your eyes?
So I'm gonna level with you guys, and for you career POs, this is gonna make you guys very unhappy. But in going on 6 years of activity in congressional debate, I have never seen a presiding officer who deserved to win a tournament, ever. Like unquestionably, I have never seen a presiding officer who deserved to win a tournament. Generally, my rule on presiding officers is that if you are a presiding officer, there are 3 types of POs. One, there is the very fast, quick, and efficient PO, which I appreciate. Second is the very charismatic, like they do some like round commentary. You don't want to be grading about it. Like you don't want to be interjecting after every speech and after every cross block. But like if you can add some moments of levity to a 3-hour round, go for it. And the third type is bad POs. Your goal is to be the first or the second or a combination of both and to never be the third. And what a bad PO looks like is somebody who's like, if I have to, as a parli, have noticed that you're taking a bunch of points of orders, and I feel like I have to be actively checking your spreadsheet to make sure that you're on track and the round is being run effectively, that's a problem, and you're probably getting dropped. In terms of like, if you were a good PO and you're, let's say, an out round, you will probably get a breaking rank from me. Let's say that's top 4 or top 5. You'll probably get a breaking rank. However, if I'm a final round PO, like this year, I served as the final round PO of both Sunvite and Harvard finals. If I'm the final round PO, do not expect to like rank in the top 4, top 5. Probably expect to rank somewhere in the top 8 if you were a decent PO. If you were a bad PO, expect to DFL. Because like even somebody who like did terribly in the round, I think there's a lot more value to somebody who's out there speaking rather than somebody who is out there presenting. Like again, I've never seen a presiding officer who deserved to win a tournament ever. And like going on 6 years, like we've seen presiding officer national champions, which is the height of lunacy to me. No presiding officer deserved to win the tournament. But in terms of like what presiding officers can do to win, kind of bolster the ranks, moments of levity are appreciated. Congress can be a slog. And this is what I said. This is my general like thought process on Congress. To do Congress and to do Congress seriously, you can't just like Congress. You have to kind of love Congress, because if you're sitting in a round for like 9 hours a day, and if you look at your speaking time through prelims, let's say you get 9 speeches throughout the entirety of prelims, which honestly might be high. Your speaking time, your total speaking time in the round, is not more than a half hour in total time, compared to like other events where like PF or like LD or like Interp or whatever else you're doing in the speechy land. You're yapping all day. You basically never get to, compared to like how much other kids in other events get to speak in Congress, you basically never have to get to speak. So most of your time is like spent like zoning out in the round, or you're flowing speeches, or you're asking questions. That is the majority of your time in Congress, or you're just sitting around. So that's generally kind of my thought process there. Tamne?
I know the last one for speakers rather than POs. How would you stand out in like a otherwise tough room where everyone is roughly equal skill set? Like you were spectating my Harvard quarter, and I felt like everyone was on a very similar level. How would you have suggested to like stand out in any room like that?
So sometimes at moments like that, when you're basically ranked, like when you're like on a comparative skill level, when you're basically ranked like the same as everybody else in the round, sometimes these are the cases in which, like, let's say if you turn to like final rounds, right, for example, you see like a lot of gimmicks, right? Like you see a lot of people like trying to go be really humorous, or like leaning into different performative aspects, or like they're really dramatic or they're really humorous. You tend to see a lot of extremes in rounds where everyone is equivalent on an equivalent level of skill. sometimes that can be a way to differentiate yourself. Another way to differentiate yourself can just be like, okay, if you are like a reasonably seasoned debater and you see yourself reasonably breaking out of, let's say, prelims, and you see yourself like advancing to the next round of elimination, to the out round, start your prep at the out round, spend most of your prep time at the out round, give the best speeches, arguments that you can, and at the end of the day, like, Congress is a completely comparative game. Judges are going to see you differently from day to day. And this is the reason why almost nobody wins tournaments in congressional debate consistently. Like, actually, I've been very impressed over the last like 2-3 years, where there are some kids on circuit who have managed to like win major T60s consecutive times, which is very impressive, because that's just very hard to do in congressional debate. Like, to this date, I don't think we've ever had a repeat national champion, although I might be mistaken. But I really don't think we've ever had a repeat national champion. I think that probably the closest person to ever do it was like Luke Tilitsky back in 2018, when he like won the year prior, and then he won the leadership role that year, I'm pretty sure. But or maybe it's 2018, 2019. Either way, that's gonna get a little bit off track. Sometimes it can help to like lean into gimmicks. Other times I think it can just help to just like lock in and kind of do the best prep and research you can. There's no hard substantive answer on what to do when everybody is on the same skill level. It's kind of just find those cleavage points where you can insert yourself and like kind of create an inflection point in the round. Because when everyone is nearly equal, you kind of, whatever you can do to differentiate yourself is probably going to be a net positive. Although there are some points of differentiation which can be a little bit too bad. A good friend of mine, a kid that I've worked with for a number of years, like my direct protege, had his last tournament at nationals, and I think national prelims, he like bought a Cornelius, and like as part of his gimmick of his speech, he kicked Cornelius, and a judge got very upset about kicking Cornelius in the middle of his speech. So depending on what you're doing, your mileage might vary with gimmicks, but it really does depend. And I think it is subjective to depending on the exact situation. With that quarter more specifically, I think maybe your best alternative was to kind of maybe get active in the amendment game, or to just do something that proves as like a major disruption to the round, not like a major in a bad way disruption, but maybe proves as a disruption in terms of like it might raise your comparative round presence. Or especially if you notice that everybody is very similar, then maybe you need to be a lot more active in the leadership game of that round, in terms of like, hey, I'm making all these motions, hey, I'm a really active participant, because especially if things are nearly equal in the judge's mind, that can sometimes make a difference as well. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thanks.
All right. Are there any further questions? Brock, do we have to wrap?
Yeah, I was just gonna say thank you so much for coming on and giving a lecture.